Late in the winter of 1889, the harbor of Marseille was shrouded in a heavy, salt-thick fog. Ships moved like phantoms across the water, their bells muffled by the damp air. On the far end of the quay, among the crates of oranges and stacks of coiled hemp rope, a man stood apart from the bustle of merchants and dockhands. His name was Elias de Vray, though it was not certain that this was his real name. He was a man of polite manners, a thin frame, and an oddly intense gaze, the sort of eyes that seemed to be focused on something far beyond the horizon. For months, whispers had circulated through the cities and smoky reading rooms about this peculiar figure. Elias claimed to have discovered, or at least located, the lost city of Atlantis. He did not speak of it with the wild-eyed mania of a crank, but in the patient, measured voice of a man describing a place he had actually seen. He spoke of white stone avenues stretching into the sea of statues so weathered they seemed to be made of coral, of a great plaza surrounded by colonnades half buried in silt and drifting weed. He claimed to have seen it all during a private expedition somewhere west of the Strait of Gibraltar, far out in the Atlantic, where the water took on a strange turquoise glow at certain depths. The detail with which he described it was unnerving. He knew the dimensions of the central temple. He spoke of the symbols carved into the plinths, not quite Greek, not quite Phoenician. He even described how the light filtered down through the currents, painting the ruins in shifting bands of gold and green. And always, he ended his tales the same way. "I am going back," he would say, quietly, almost as if it were a vow. "And when I return, I will bring proof." In early March, Elias hired a small crew and a stout, weather-worn brigantine called La Belle Helene. The ship was stocked with provisions for 2 months, barrels of fresh water, coils of rope, a brass diving bell, and a collection of strange tools no one on the docks could quite identify. One dockworker later swore that among the cargo was a chest so heavy it took 4 men to load it, and that Elias never allowed it out of his sight. On the morning of March 12th, with the tide running high and the wind steady from the south, La Belle Helene slipped her moorings and headed out into the open sea. A few of the city's amateur explorers and adventurers came to watch her departure, joking about the treasure hunt and placing quiet wagers on how soon Elias would return, humbled by the Atlantic. But days passed, then weeks. The ship did not return. By late May, rumors began to stir. A fishing vessel claimed to have seen a ship matching La Belle Helene far to the southwest, well beyond the usual shipping lanes. Another report said she was spotted in calm seas, drifting without sails, but no official record was made. By midsummer, the truth became impossible to ignore. Elias de Vray, his crew, and his mysterious cargo had vanished entirely. The newspapers had a field day. Some called it a tragic accident, a storm, a rogue wave, the perils of deep-sea diving. Others hinted at darker possibilities: mutiny, sabotage, even piracy. A few more fanciful suggested that perhaps Elias really had found his Atlantis and chosen never to return. In the years that followed, pieces of the story took on the weight of legend. A diver in Madeira claimed to have found fragments of white marble on the seabed, carved with strange symbols. A bottle washed ashore in the Azores contained a water-stained scrap of paper bearing only the words, "It is not lost, it sleeps." Some said it was Elias's handwriting. Others insisted it was a hoax. What is certain is this: After the morning of March 12, 1889, Elias de Vraa was never seen again. No wreckage was found. No bodies were recovered. The ocean kept whatever secrets it held, and somewhere out beyond the horizon, perhaps beneath a shifting canopy of blue-green light, the ruins he described might still be waiting. And so, his name remains tethered to the mystery of Atlantis, not as a man who proved it, but as one who chased it into the deep and never came back. The harbor of Marseille, in the waning light of winter, had a way of swallowing sound. The gulls still wheeled and cried above the masts, but their voices seemed to drift into the pale mist that clung to the water, softening into nothing. The smell of brine tar and faintly rotting seaweed mingled with the scent of coffee from the waterfront, where men in long coats and low-crowned hats sat with newspapers folded under one arm, their other hand cupped around steaming porcelain cups. It was here, in this muted world of clinking, rigging, and slow-moving dock carts, that Elias de Vraa was first noticed. He was not a man to announce himself with fanfare. Those who recalled him would later say it was his stillness, more than anything, that set him apart. While other men paced or shouted to be heard over the labor of loading a ship, Elias stood quietly, hands clasped loosely behind his back, as though his thoughts were tethered to some invisible point far beyond the horizon. His coat was of fine but worn wool, the cuffs showing the faint fray of long use. His boots were clean but scuffed, and his eyes, a pale, almost grayish green, had a way of resting on the water, as if he could see through it entirely, to some place waiting below. In the along the Rue de la, his name began to surface in low conversations. He was a man of knowledge, some said, an antiquarian who had traveled in Egypt and across the Aegean. Others claimed he had once been a naval cartographer, quietly dismissed after some dispute with the Admiralty. The truth of his past was as mutable as the sea itself, shifting with each retelling, but the one detail that remained constant, and which drew the attention of adventurers, amateur historians, and idle curiosity seekers alike, was his claim to have found the lost city of Atlantis, not merely as an idea, not as a dream drawn from Plato's dialogues, but as a place, a location, somewhere far out in the Atlantic, west of the Strait of Gibraltar, where the water took on an otherworldly shade in the right light. He spoke of avenues of pale stone, broad enough for chariots to pass in their day, now lying beneath drifting gardens of kelp. He described colonnades encrusted with barnacles, their capitals carved in a style no living scholar could quite name. There were plazas where mosaics lay half-buried in silt, still glinting with the deep blues and golds of their tesserae when struck by a beam of sunlight from above. These were not the ravings of a man gone mad with salt and solitude. Elias spoke with the careful precision of one accustomed to measuring a coastline, to noting depth and current. He could tell you the direction of the prevailing winds in the region, the pattern of tides at certain times of year. He spoke of his previous voyage with a quiet gravity, and of his intention to return, not for personal glory, but to bring back proof. Some evenings, in the glow of oil lamps, he would unroll a worn piece of parchment on the cafe table. Upon it, lines in faded ink traced the outline of a coastline that seemed to hover somewhere between the real and the imagined. Symbols marked points of interest, annotated in a fine hand. Those who glimpsed it swore it was no map they had ever seen in published form. When pressed, Elias would fold it away without irritation, only saying it is not ready for the world. When at last he announced his plan to depart, the harbor took note. On the morning of March 12, 1889, the brigantine La Belle Helene stood ready at her berth. She was a sturdy vessel, her hull of dark oak showing the long scars of years at sea, her rigging freshly tarred. A crew of 8 was assembled, weathered men with the lean, rope-hard muscles of those who have hauled sails in every wind. Barrels of water and salt pork were rolled aboard, sacks of flour and coffee, crates whose contents remained discreetly closed. Among them was a single chest of iron-bound mahogany, its brass lock polished to a dull gleam. 4 men struggled to lift it aboard, and Elias himself oversaw its stowage in the captain's cabin. The wind was a gentle, southerly, and as the tide turned, the brigantine's sails unfurled in a slow, graceful bloom. Those on the quay watched as she slipped from her berth, her prow cutting the mist. Some waved, a few called out good-natured jests. Elias stood at the stern, one gloved hand resting on the rail, his gaze fixed ahead, and then she was gone, her masts diminishing into the gray horizon, the sound of her wake fading into the steady lap of the tide against the stone quay. The first days at sea carried with them the peculiar rhythm that only sailors truly understand, a blend of constant motion and unhurried timelessness, as though the ship itself dictated the pace of life. The La Belle Helene leaned gently to the wind, her timbers creaking in the slow, measured language of oak and rope. The sea was calm enough to lull a landsman into forgetting its dangers, its surface broken only by the silver flash of fish and the occasional ripple from a current unseen. The sky above was a pale, washed blue, the kind that seems to have been faded by centuries of sun and salt, and in the distance, the coast of Provence dissolved into the morning haze until it was no more than a faint suggestion against the horizon. Elias de Vray moved quietly among the crew in those early days, speaking only when necessary, and always in a low, steady tone. He was no stranger to the work of a ship, though he left the trimming of sails and the tightening of halyards to the men who had spent their lives at it. He lent a hand without hesitation when the wind shifted or a sheet came loose. The crew, for their part, were watchful. They knew the stories whispered on the docks. They had heard the word Atlantis spoken in taverns, and while most laughed it off as a rich man's folly, there was something about Elias's manner that kept them from voicing their doubts too loudly. He was not a man aflame with madness. Rather, he was a man with a chart folded deep inside his mind, and every step he took seemed to be guided by it. Meals aboard the La Belle Helene were plain and unhurried. Hard bread softened in broth, salt pork boiled until it gave up the worst of its brine, and coffee brewed dark enough to cut through the morning fog. At night, the crew would gather on the main deck, smoking pipes or mending lines by lamplight, while the sea whispered softly against the hull. Elias rarely joined in their idle talk, preferring to stand by the stern rail, looking westward, one by one over the water like ancient fires rekindled. By the 7th day, the coast had long since vanished, and the brigantine sailed in that endless, shifting realm where sea and sky meet in an unbroken circle. The wind freshened from the northeast, filling the sails with a long, steady pull that set the Helene running clean and sure. Gulls no longer followed them. In their place, the occasional petrel skimmed low across the swells, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The days fell into a pattern. Sunrise over a restless horizon, the slow arc of the sun overhead, and the long, violet evenings when the sea seemed to hold its breath before night fully claimed it. It was on the 12th evening that Elias brought out the map. The captain, a man named Duval, with the weathered face of one who had spent more years at sea than ashore, watched him carefully as he spread the parchment across the table in the cramped, lantern-lit cabin. The edges were worn and salt-stained. The ink faded in places, but the lines were precise. Each curve of the imagined coastline drawn with the hand of a practiced cartographer. There was no label for the landmass depicted, no compass rose, no latitudes or longitudes marked in the usual way. Instead, faint notations in a delicate, looping script ran along certain edges, some in French, others in a language Duval did not recognize. Elias traced a line with his finger. From a point west of Gibraltar, out into what seemed to any ordinary sailor to be empty sea. Here, he said quietly, is where it lies. Beneath no more than 30 fathoms at the shallowest point, the rest is deeper. He spoke without the feverish glint of a man chasing myths. His voice was calm, almost solemn, as though reciting a truth known to him alone. The captain said nothing at first, only leaning back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And if it isn't there?" he asked at last. Elias folded the map with deliberate care, returning it to the leather case at his side. "Then we will know," he replied, "and I will be the one who bears the weight of that knowledge." From that night onward, the course of the La Belle Helene seemed fixed to an invisible star. Days lengthened into weeks, the air grew warmer, and the deep indigo of the Atlantic replaced the paler blues of the coastal waters. The seafloor beneath them dropped away into darkness, and strange things began to drift up. Strands of kelp longer than a man's height, pieces of coral polished smooth by currents, and once a carved fragment of stone that the crew swore had no business being in the open ocean. Elias examined each find with a quiet, measured gaze, saying little, but the set of his jaw grew ever more certain. At night, the sky became a black vault, pricked with an impossible number of stars, so many that it seemed they might spill into the sea. And always, in the far west, there was a faint, almost imperceptible glow on the horizon. So faint that most of the crew dismissed it as a trick of the eyes. Elias, however, saw it each night, and though he never spoke of it openly, he began spending more hours at the rail after dark, as if waiting for the glow to sharpen into something tangible. The wind carried them on, steady and patient, into waters where few ships bothered to wander. Charts became less reliable here, currents more capricious. The crew spoke more quietly, as though the sea itself might be listening. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the water was at its stillest, more than one sailor swore they could hear something beneath the waves, not the groan of the hull, not the sigh of the wind in the rigging, but a slow, distant pulse, like the beating of a heart deep in the ocean's dark. It began with a change in the color of the water, so subtle at first that only the helmsman noticed it, and even then he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. For days, the La Belle Helene had been sailing over the deep, dark indigo of the open Atlantic, the kind of blue that seemed almost black under a midday sun. But now, just after dawn, the hue softened, taking on a greenish undertone, as though some hidden light were bleeding upward from beneath the waves. The sky above was cloudless, the wind light but steady, and the surface of the sea was so smooth It seemed to have been poured rather than stirred by tide and current. The crew grew restless in the way sailors do. When something in the natural order feels slightly off, conversations grew shorter. Meals were eaten in silence. The men found excuses to come to the rail, to stare into the water with knitted brows, searching for the source of the strange tint. Even Captain Duval, a man not easily unsettled, took to pacing the quarterdeck with his hands clasped behind his back, glancing frequently toward the horizon. Elias DeVray seemed to notice the change as well, though he made no announcement. Instead, he spent long hours in the bow, leaning slightly over the side, his eyes fixed on the water as if reading some script written in the slow undulations of the swell. When approached, he would answer politely but without elaboration, returning almost at once to his silent vigil. The crew began to avoid disturbing him, their curiosity tempered by the sense that whatever he was waiting for lay just ahead, and that they might soon see it for themselves. On the fifth morning of this strange green light, the wind dropped away entirely. The sails hung slack, stirring only with the faintest breath of air, and the ship drifted, carried now only by the sluggish push of some unseen current. The sea was glass, the horizon a perfect circle, where sky and water met without seam. It was then that the first shape appeared beneath them, a pale smudge, deep but not impossibly so, growing sharper as the sun climbed higher. At first, it looked like an outcropping of rock, perhaps the jagged crest of some submerged ridge. But as the brigantine drifted closer, the lines became too straight, the angles too deliberate. A rectangle took shape, then another, the two connected by what appeared to be a narrow span. The water's strange clarity allowed the forms to reveal themselves slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. Low walls, broken columns, and what could only be the remains of a stairway descending into shadow. The crew crowded the rail, muttering in low voices. Some swore they saw carvings on the stones, faint patterns that glimmered when the sun struck at the right angle. Others claimed they could make out the bases of statues, the figures long since eroded away by centuries of tide. A few men backed away, crossing themselves without a word, unwilling to look any longer. Elias, however, did not move. He stood at the very front of the ship, his hands gripping the rail so tightly that his knuckles whitened, his gaze locked on the ruins below. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely louder than the creak of the hull. "This is only the edge," he said. "The rest lies further on." The current seemed to know where to take them. Without sail or oar, the La Belle Helene drifted westward, passing over more structures, toppled pillars, broad plazas choked with sand. What looked like the foundations of vast halls, whose walls had long since crumbled. The green light in the water deepened, casting the ruins in an unearthly glow, so that even the most skeptical of the crew began to feel the weight of something ancient and uncanny pressing against the hull. As evening approached, a haze began to gather at the horizon, not the gray of storm clouds, but a strange, pale shimmer, as though the air itself were turning to glass. Elias ordered the anchor dropped, an unusual decision in such open waters, and spent the night on deck, pacing, pausing often to stare into the darkness below. Some of the crew claimed that, in the hours before dawn, the green light flared brighter for a moment, and that in its glow they saw not ruins, but streets lined with columns and arches, perfectly intact, as if the city were merely waiting for its inhabitants to return. No one slept well that night. Dreams came heavy and vivid, filled with the sound of slow, rhythmic waves that did not match the ship's gentle rocking. In the morning, Elias was nowhere to be seen. The captain found him in the hold, sorting through the contents of the iron-bound chest, brass instruments, small leather-bound journals, a pair of heavy gloves, and something wrapped in oilcloth, whose shape none of the men could guess. Elias said nothing of what he intended to do with these items, only that the ship would move on at first light. When the anchor was raised, the current resumed its quiet pull, carrying them toward the shimmering haze. The men worked in near silence, their eyes darting often to the green glow below. By midday, the ruins had given way to what looked like open seabed, smooth and bare, but Elias stood taller at the bow, as though he could see something the rest could not. The haze ahead thickened, and the air grew unnaturally still. Even the sound of the water against the hull seemed to fade. And then, just as the sun reached its zenith, the prow of the La Belle Helene crossed into the veil, and the sea beneath them vanished into a depthless blue, so deep it seemed to draw the gaze downward, endlessly downward. Inside the haze, the world altered in ways so subtle at first that a man might doubt his senses. The light grew diffuse, as though the sun were shining through frosted glass. The sky overhead lost its sharp blue edge and became a pale, opalescent dome, shifting faintly with each slow breath of the wind. Sound seemed to travel differently here. The creak of the rigging was muted, the slap of the water against the hull softened, and even voices, when the crew spoke at all, carried a low, muffled quality, as if uttered inside a vast, empty hall. Beneath the La Belle Helene, the water deepened into a blue so rich and so dark that it appeared almost solid, yet within it there were movements, soft glimmers, faint spirals of light shapes that came and went before the eye could truly focus on them. The green glow that had accompanied them for days was gone now, replaced by this darker radiance, a color that seemed to pull at the mind, urging it to peer further, to try to see what lay far below. The current was stronger here, though the sails hung slack and the air was barely stirring. The ship moved forward at a steady pace, drawn toward some unseen destination. The men glanced often at Elias, but he offered no explanation. His hands rested lightly on the rail, and his gaze was fixed ahead, not downward now, as if whatever he sought lay beyond the reach of the water entirely. As the day wore on, the haze grew thicker, and the horizon disappeared altogether. There was no longer a line where sea met sky, only a vast, unbroken expanse of pale shimmer stretching in all directions. It was impossible to tell how far they had come, or in which direction they were truly heading. The compass, which Captain Duval checked often, spun in slow, irregular arcs, as though uncertain of its own purpose. By late afternoon, a faint vibration began to hum through the timbers of the ship. It was not the groan of wood under strain or the shudder of a swell against the hull, but a steady, low thrum, too deep to be heard, yet felt in the bones. The crew shifted uneasily, glancing at one another without speaking. Some pressed their palms to the deck as if to be sure it was not their imagination. Elias said nothing, but the corners of his mouth tightened, not in fear, but in the way of a man who knows he has reached the threshold of something long pursued. Then, just before the sun should have begun its descent, the light changed again. The opalescent haze grew warmer, taking on a golden cast, as if the air itself were lit from within. Shadows deepened on the deck, though no clouds crossed the sun. And in the distance, though distance had become a meaningless concept here, there appeared the suggestion of form, not on the water, but beneath it. It began as a dark mass, rising slowly from the blue, its shape resolving by degrees, great terraces, wide steps, the faint arch of what might once have been a bridge. Then more shapes emerged, tall pillars, avenues lined with what looked like the ruins of immense statues, some toppled, some still standing, their features worn smooth by ages of current. The scale was staggering. Even half buried in the depths, the structures dwarfed anything known on land. A murmur rose among the crew, part AW, part dread. One man whispered a prayer. Another swore he saw lights moving among the ruins, slow, deliberate flickers, like lanterns carried along unseen streets. Elias did not look away. His eyes were wide now, but not in shock. They held the quiet, relentless satisfaction of a man who has found exactly what he was seeking. The current drew them closer. The shapes below grew clearer, their details sharper. Carvings of strange, unfamiliar beasts, patterns of lines and spirals in the stone. Vast plazas littered with fallen blocks that must each have weighed more than the ship itself. And then, as if they had crossed another invisible line, a wave of pressure seemed to pass through the hull, a silent, heavy force that pressed at the ears and set the heart racing. In that moment, the air itself seemed to grow heavy, the haze thickening until it became almost a mist, curling along the deck, beating on the ropes, dampening the men's hair. The temperature dropped suddenly, the warm gold light giving way to a cold, pale gleam that made every shadow sharp and deep. The hum in the timbers swelled, rising in pitch until it was no longer felt but heard, a low, resonant note that filled the air and vibrated in the lungs. The last thing the men on deck remembered clearly was the way the water changed color once more. It shifted from that deep, impossible blue to a strange, luminous silver, so bright it seemed the sea was lit from within. Shapes moved within it, not fish, not anything that swam in known waters, but vast, slow silhouettes, their outlines blurring, as if the eye could not quite accept their form. And then, nothing. No storm, no crash, no splintering of wood or tearing of sail. Only silence. The La Belle Helene did not return to Marseille. She was not found adrift, nor was any wreckage ever recovered. The sea, as it always does, closed over whatever had happened and kept it. The haze vanished from those waters, and ships passing through in later years reported nothing unusual. No green light, no strange currents, no ruins glimpsed below. Only a few fragments of the story survived in the mouths of those who had heard Elias speak in the faded notes of dock workers who had watched him load his iron-bound chest, in the yellowing newspapers that once printed his name alongside the word Atlantis. And even those, like all stories drawn from the deep, began to blur at the edges over time, until it was impossible to say where fact ended and legend began. Some claimed he had found it and stayed. Others said the city had taken him, just as it had taken itself from the world thousands of years before. And most simply agreed on this. After that day, inside the shimmering haze, Elias de Vray, his crew, and the La Belle Helene were never seen again. The docks of Marseille. The year was 1889, though the docks of Marseille looked much as they had for decades before. The cobblestones bore the smooth shine of countless boots and hooves. The air smelled of salt and hemp and spilled wine, and gulls wheeled overhead with the same harsh, quarrelsome cries they had been using to claim scraps since time immemorial. The ships in the harbor sat in various states of readiness. Some freshly arrived, their sails slack and dark with spray. Others tethered and half unloaded, their holds breathing out the mixed scents of coffee, citrus, and wet oak. And still others being prepared for departure with decks, scrubbed lines coiled and barrels rolled into place by men with sleeves rolled to the elbow. A winter sun hung pale over the city, more silver than gold, casting long shadows between the warehouses. In the narrow lanes, the taverns were already doing brisk business, their windows clouded with heat from within. Voices, French, Italian, Greek, Arabic, and others less easily placed, mingled with the groan of cartwheels, the rhythm of hammers on iron fittings, and the occasional shouted warning from a crane operator high above the quay. It was here, in this persistent, ceaseless hum of work and movement, that Elias de Vray was first noticed. Not noticed for the first time in his life. He had been a familiar figure to a handful of traders and seamen over the years, but noticed in that particular way a man is when his presence suddenly has purpose. He stood near the water's edge, beside a stack of cargo bound for the La Belle Helene, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his gloves pale from where his eyes, gray with the faintest green when the light caught them, followed the crew as they worked, but without the fretful impatience of a captain. Rather, there was a stillness to him, as though he were measuring the hours until some moment only he knew was coming. The La Belle Helene herself was a handsome three-masted bark of moderate size, her hull painted a deep, polished black that gleamed even under the thin sun. The figurehead, carved decades earlier, was of a woman in Grecian drapery, her arms extended forward, palms open, as though offering something unseen to the waves. Her eyes, painted with a faint blue wash, seemed almost to glisten in the shifting light. Sailors were superstitious about figureheads. Some swore a well-made one could guard a ship through the worst seas, while others insisted it could just as easily curse her, if the woman it portrayed had been wronged. Elias had chosen her for this voyage with quiet deliberation, though few knew why. He had made other arrangements with equal care. The sealed wooden chest that had arrived at the dock 2 days prior, the rolled parchment maps carried in oilskin tubes, the crates of instruments marked not for trade but for navigation and surveying. Among those watching from the quay was Henry Capit, a cooper, who had been on friendly terms with Elias for some years. Henry later claimed to have overheard snatches of conversation between Elias and the captain, talk of coordinates far out in the Atlantic, of weather that did not behave as weather ought, and of stone not laid by any hand we'd call human. Most dismissed Henry's account as drunken embroidery, for he was rarely far from a wine flask. Still, the words lingered among the dockworkers in the days that followed, the way such phrases do when they carry the faint smell of a mystery. The crew assigned to the La Belle Helene were a varied lot. Some were long-serving hands who knew her well. Others had been taken on in the last week, enticed by the promise of good pay for a voyage of uncertain length. One was a Portuguese carpenter named Duarte, who had sailed the coasts of Brazil and claimed to have seen ghost lights over the mid-Atlantic trenches. Another was a Breton cook called Ailing, whose soups were legendary but whose temper was short. There was the young Englishman Thomas Crow, barely 20 and green as new rope, eager for adventure but given to seasickness in the gentlest swells. And there was old Matthew, who had worked the docks since before Elias was born and was now serving as boatswain for what he said would be his final voyage. They were a crew used to the rhythms of departure, the stowing of gear, the chalking of inventory against the ship's ledger, the measuring of fresh water, the slow but certain tightening of discipline as the day drew nearer. And over it all was the sound of the sea itself, that low, patient heartbeat against the harbor wall, a reminder that all human plans were ultimately subject to its will. As the week passed, the gossip spread. Some said Elias had been commissioned by a wealthy patron in Paris to search for new trade routes. Others whispered of treasure ships lost in centuries past, their holds still heavy with gold. A few, remembering the books Elias was often seen carrying, heavy, leather-bound volumes on ancient history, geology, and myth, spoke the word Atlantis, half as a joke, half in wonder. It was not the first time that name had been uttered on these docks, nor would it be the last, but it was the first time in many years that it was spoken with such a sense of impending voyage. On the final night before departure, Elias was seen in the lamplight outside a tavern, speaking softly with Captain Duval. The captain was a tall man with weather-creased skin, his hair and beard iron gray, his eyes quick and steady. They spoke for some time, their words low enough that none could be clearly overheard, though a fragment carried on the wind to where Henry Capet stood. If the currents hold, we'll see it by the third week, if the haze is still there. Henry swore years later that the moment he heard those words, the hairs on his neck stood up, not from fear, but from the strange certainty that the ship S-course would take her somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary charts. Casting off, morning came with a pale sky that carried no promise of warmth. The wind, soft but steady from the northwest, stirred the lines along the quay, so that they tapped and groaned against their wooden moorings. The air was sharp with the smell of brine and wet rope, of tar warming slowly in the first touch of sunlight. By the time the church bells of Marseille began their 7 o'clock peal, the crew of the La Belle Helene were already at their tasks. Boots thudded on her deck, voices called from mast to mast, barrels rolled up the gangplank and were lashed down in the forehold. The ship's cook Oling was shouting at a pair of boys who had been hired to bring fresh loaves from the bakery, berating them for letting the bread cool too long in the morning air. Elias de Vray stood on the quarterdeck, watching not the men but the sea beyond the harbor mouth. There was a light there, not a true glow, nothing to mark it apart from any other horizon, but a quality of silver in the waves that seemed to draw his gaze. From where he stood, one could look past the breakwater and see the endless blue-gray plain of the Mediterranean stretching toward the narrow passage between Corsica and Sardinia, and beyond that, the Atlantic. The captain arrived soon after, his coat buttoned high, the brim of his hat cutting a sharp shadow over his eyes. He greeted Elias with a nod, glanced over the deck, and barked a short order to the boatswain. Lines were loosed. The sails, already unfurled, began to fill with that same clean wind that had whispered against the quay all morning. On shore, a small crowd had gathered, wives, children, and the curious, each with their own reason for being there. Some waved, others merely watched, arms folded. Henry Capet stood apart from them, leaning on the railing of the dock with a half-empty flask in hand. He didn't wave, he only watched Elias, and later said that the man seemed already half gone, his thoughts far out to sea, even as the ship was still moored. The lines went slack, then snaked into the water as they were cast off entirely. The La Belle Helene began to move, slowly at first, her hull easing away from the quay with the gentle stubbornness of a vessel reluctant to leave safe harbor. The captain's voice rang out in the clean morning air. Short, precise commands, each met with a chorus of "aye" from the crew. The sound of the gulls swelled overhead, then began to fade as the distance widened. Elias leaned on the rail, watching the water churn under the bow. Somewhere below, invisible but certain, the harbor's familiar bottom fell away into deeper channels, and the sea began to take her. The masts creaked, the rigging hummed with the wind, and the city of Marseille, with all its shouts and smells and stone, began to recede into the soft blur of the morning light. Beyond the breakwater, the Mediterranean opened wide, her surface restless but not unkind. The La Belle Helene turned her bow westward toward the distant strait, and took on the steady rhythm of a ship settling into her course. Sailcloth snapped above, then smoothed into a taut, full curve. The ship heeled slightly to port, as though leaning into the journey ahead. Elias stayed on deck through the morning, rarely speaking, though now and then he glanced toward the compass, binnacle, or the horizon, as if marking something only he could see. When the captain joined him, they spoke briefly, a few words about wind and tide, about the likely time to the Balearics, and then fell silent again. By noon, Marseille was no more than a line of pale stone against the curve of the coast, and by evening, only the faint glow of its lamps remained, far astern and dwindling. That night, the first at sea, Elias went below to his cabin and wrote for hours by lamplight, the pages filled with careful script, notations in the margin, and symbols that even a practiced navigator might find unfamiliar. When at last he set his pen aside, he sat for some time listening to the creak and sigh of the ship as she moved through the darkness, her timbers speaking in that old, slow language known only to vessels and the men who sailed them. Up on deck, the stars had come out in their full winter array. Old Matthew at the wheel hummed a tune so quietly that only the man standing nearest could hear it. The sea, calm, under the moon, spread in every direction like a sheet of hammered silver. And somewhere ahead, far beyond the edge of sight, was the course Elias had plotted, a line drawn not just across the chart, but across the unknown. The days of the voyage. The days began to find their shape quickly, as they always do aboard a ship. Dawn broke in pale washes of gold and gray, the sea breathing slow swells that lifted the La Belle Helene as though testing her weight. The bell forward rang the change of watch, its dull brass tone carrying far in the still air. Boots scraped the deck as one group of men descended to their bunks, and another took their place, rubbing sleep from their eyes, pulling oilskins close against the early chill. The mornings held a kind of peace, broken only by the slap of water against the hull and the low murmur of voices. Alling the cook would have a kettle of coffee ready, its scent drifting aft, mingling with the smell of salt and tar. The men queued for their share, tin mugs warming their hands, the steam fogging the air between them. They drank, standing, always standing, swaying a little with the ship's slow roll. Elias was never first to take coffee, but neither was he last. He would arrive quietly, take a mug, and stand apart near the rail, gazing toward the horizon as he sipped. Sometimes the captain joined him, and they'd exchange a few words about the wind, the current, the next waypoint. But Elias seemed to prefer silence. If he noticed the sidelong glances the crew gave him, he didn't show it. By mid-morning, the work began in earnest. Lines were checked and coiled, the deck scrubbed with seawater, brass polished until it caught the sun like fire. Sailcloth was inspected for wear, and repairs were made as needed. The sharp sound of needle through canvas carrying across the open deck. The men worked without complaint. A ship at sea left no room for idleness. Some afternoons were spent in drills, the captain's voice crisp and commanding. Orders answered in unison as the crew practiced reefing sail, shifting ballast, and readying the ship for sudden squalls. Even in calm weather, the drills were taken seriously. At sea, one learned early that the sky could turn in a heartbeat. When the work was done, there was the long stretch of time between duty and darkness. Some men mended clothes, others played cards in the shade of the foresail. Old Matthew carved small figures from driftwood, his knife working steadily, the curls of pale shavings gathering at his feet. The younger sailors watched him, fascinated, but he said little, his focus on the grain beneath his hands. Elias kept mostly to his cabin in those hours, poring over charts and notebooks. Now and then, he'd come on deck with his sextant, sighting the sun with a precision that bordered on obsession. The captain allowed it. Elias was not crew, but passenger, though one with an uncommon familiarity with the ship's course. The evenings were the heart of the voyage's rhythm. Supper was eaten on deck, when weather allowed, the men sitting cross-legged with their plates balanced on their knees. Conversation drifted from port to port, from storms survived to ports missed, to tales of ships seen once and never again. The sea at night was a world unto itself. The sky so deep and clear it seemed one could fall upward into it. The stars sharp as ice. The ship's wake glowed faintly with phosphorescence, a ribbon of ghostly light trailing into the dark. It was on one such night, as Elias leaned on the rail, watching the wake shimmer, that he first saw it, a brief flicker of green far out on the water. It was nothing certain, nothing he could point to. It might have been the reflection of starlight on a cresting wave, but it held his gaze for longer than reason would allow. When it faded, he looked to the captain, but the man was at the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead, as if he too had seen something and thought better of speaking. The days rolled on, the sea carrying them westward. The wind stayed steady, the weather fair. But each night, Elias began to notice it, a faint green glimmer, always far, always gone too soon. And each night, he lingered longer at the rail, his coffee cooling in his hand, his eyes scanning the dark until the watch changed and the stars wheeled on. Whispers of the green light, it began as a rumor no one admitted to starting. A murmur here, a half-remark there, carried on the wind between watches, spoken without looking at the listener, as though naming it directly might make it real. The La Belle Helene still kept her rhythm, the creak of her timbers, the flap and snap of canvas, as the wind shifted the bell, marking the passage of hours. But beneath that steady surface, something subtle had shifted. It was in the way the men moved about the deck after dark, in how they avoided the forward rail unless duty demanded it. It was in the way old Matthew stopped his carving when the sun dipped, no matter how much work was left, tucking his knife away as though darkness itself could dull the blade. The first to speak plainly was a young sailor named Renaud, barely 20, with freckles scattered across his nose and a laugh that usually came too loud. One night, during the dog watch, he came down from the foredeck pale and tight-lipped, his laugh gone entirely. He said nothing until pressed by his bunkmate, and even then he only muttered, "It's there again, in the water." No one asked what it was. They already knew. The green light had become a presence on the voyage, not constant, not predictable, but persistent. Some nights it appeared only once, a faint, slow pulse far off the starboard bow. Other nights, it flickered again and again, like some distant lantern dipped below the waves and raised anew, never close, never loud, but never gone for long. Elias noticed more than most. He began rising in the middle of the night to stand at the rail, his coat pulled tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Sometimes he brought his notebook, sketching symbols that bore no resemblance to navigational marks. Other times, he stood unmoving, as though listening to something deep below the waterline. The captain, for his part, said nothing about the light. When asked, he brushed it off. Tricks of the sea, reflections of the stars, the glow of distant fishing boats. But his tone was too quick, his answers too neat. And more than once, Elias caught him watching the horizon with a stillness that betrayed concern. By the second week, even the routines of the ship seemed altered. Meals grew quieter, conversations shorter. The younger sailors kept their eyes on the deckboards when walking at night, avoiding the temptation to look over the side. Only Elias seemed to welcome it. He began noting not just the times of the light's appearance, but the tide, the wind, and the position of certain stars when it came. In his cramped cabin, lit by the swinging oil lamp, he marked these observations on his chart, drawing thin lines that curved away from the La Belle Helene's plotted course. One night, as the wind died to a hush and the sea lay still as molten glass, the light appeared closer than before, not close enough to see its source, but near enough to make the water under it shimmer with that strange, living green. The watch on deck froze where they stood, their faces caught between awe and dread. No one spoke, no one moved. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The dark closed over it, the waves returned, and the ship's slow rocking resumed. But from that night forward, sleep came harder to the crew, and more than one man was seen crossing himself before climbing into his hammock. Other men who searched. The weather held, but the air of the La Belle Helene grew stranger still. Men worked as they always had, but with the quiet discipline of those who have begun to count days without admitting why. Elias spent more time in the chart room, but not always with charts. Often, he spread before him pages from a battered leather case, clippings, letters, and fragile sketches in faded ink. It was during one such evening, the lamp swaying gently above the table, that old Matthew wandered in. He was not a man for idle talk, but something in Elias's intense study caught his interest. "What's that then?" Matthew asked, leaning over to glance at the papers. Elias smiled faintly. The stories of other men who went looking. Some came back, most did not. He laid out a sheet bearing a fine, looping script. Ignatius Donnelly, Elias said, American congressman, 1882, wrote Atlantis, the antediluvian world. Claimed all ancient civilizations were but the scattered remnants of that one, lost in a cataclysm. He never saw it himself, of course, but he set others looking. Matthew grunted, half interested, until Elias placed another clipping down. Captain Brasser, 1891, claimed to have found ruins on the sea floor off Madeira. Coral-grown columns, steps cut from single blocks of stone, said the sea took them back before he could return. Vanished near the Canaries on his second voyage. Another scrap, a photograph, grainy and water-stained. Men in oilskins hauling something heavy from the surf. A carved slab, its markings worn but deliberate. Elias's finger traced the faint spirals carved into its face. Professor Dewar of Bremen, Elias went on, 1902, sent word he'd found a submerged plateau west of the Azores. His telegram, promised proof. The proof never came. His ship was sighted once more, then not again. Matthew shifted uneasily. And you believe all this? Ilias's eyes did not leave the table. I believe men do not vanish without cause. I believe the sea hides more than it reveals. From then on, Matthew noticed things he had not before. The way Elias marked their course against lines that were not on the ship's official charts. The way he would sometimes glance over the rail with a small, knowing nod when the green light returned. The other men began to whisper of it, not openly, but in the way sailors speak of omens. They knew the names now: Donnelly, Brasser, Dewar, and perhaps, without saying it aloud, they wondered if they themselves were about to join that list into the quiet sea. The days lengthened as though time itself had slowed. Morning light came in pale, glassy tones, and evenings lingered in drawn-out shades of blue before sinking into a darkness that felt almost deliberate. The La Belle Helene kept her steady course west-southwest, sails straining gently against a wind so constant it felt prearranged. The sea had changed its texture. No longer did it carry the bright chop of the open Atlantic. Now it rolled in slow, oil-dark swells, each one rising and falling, as though some immense heart beat beneath. The water took on a depth of color Elias likened to polished obsidian, so dark it seemed to drink in the sunlight. The crew grew quiet. They still worked, hands on lines, boots on deck, but the easy banter faded. The soundscape of the ship became one of wood, rope, and sea alone. Even the ship's bell seemed muffled, as though its notes did not wish to carry far. Elias had changed as well. He no longer lingered over meals with the others, instead taking his ration quickly and returning to his cabin or the quarterdeck. At night, he stood for hours at the rail, gaze fixed on the black horizon. Some of the men swore they saw him murmuring to himself or listening intently as though the waves were speaking in some code. One evening, as the sun bled low and the wind dropped to a lazy sigh, Elias gathered a few of the crew on deck. From inside his case, he withdrew a sheaf of yellowed pages and laid them flat on a coiled hawser. Mariner's logs, he explained, written by hands that have been dust for decades. I found them in an antiquarian's shop, and the men leaned in. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, but the words were clear enough in the fading light. July 14th, 1851. Saw towers beneath the waves. Pale stone, worn smooth, not coral. Could not be coral. Another page. August 2nd, 1867. Entered a sea without birds or fish. The water green and bright at night. A low hum heard through the hull, and another, more fragmentary ink, blotted and blurred by damp. No stars tonight. The sky a single black sheet, lights below, shapes moving slow, larger than whales. Elias tapped the last one. Captain for his ship, the Ardent, vanished a week after writing this. No wreckage, no message. Only these pages, found in a bottle 2 years later, washed ashore in Bermuda. The men exchanged glances. Someone muttered a prayer under his breath. That night, the green glow returned, stronger than before. It came not as a flicker or a streak, but as a vast, steady pulse beneath the ship, shifting with the swells. It lit the undersides of the waves in dim emerald, giving the impression that the La Belle Helene sailed not on water, but on a pane of glass set above some other, hidden world. Elias stayed on deck until dawn, his eyes fixed downward. In the morning, when the cook brought him coffee, he asked only one question. Did you hear it? The cook blinked. Hear what? The hum. The man shook his head and hurried off. But as the day wore on, a few of the others began to admit, reluctantly, quietly, that yes, perhaps, there had been something, a faint vibration, felt more in the chest than heard in the ears. A sound without a source. The sea remained calm. Too calm. No fish broke the surface. No gull followed their wake. The air itself seemed to thicken. The horizon ringed in a haze that blurred the line between water and sky. The captain ordered double watches, though he could give no clear reason why. By the third day in this quiet sea, the crew no longer joked. They spoke in low voices, if at all, and avoided looking over the rail for too long. Only Elias seemed untouched by the growing unease. If anything, he appeared invigorated, sharper, more certain, as though each strange sign confirmed what he had always known. And on the fourth night, the hum became a rhythm. If you want, I can make the next part even longer, stretching the approach to the site into a slow, hypnotic sequence where reality starts to blur, layering in more lost expedition history, until it feels like the ship is sailing through centuries, not just miles. Waters without a century. The fifth day in the quiet sea began with a sunrise that refused to finish. The light swelled slowly from the horizon, but it never seemed to crest into full day. Instead, the ship sailed in a half-world, not dawn, not noon, a pale silvery glow that flattened distance and made the ocean look endless in every direction. The crew noticed it first, in small ways, shadows that fell softer than they should, the sun's warmth thinner on the skin. Someone muttered that it felt like sailing inside a dream that wasn't their own. The hum was constant now, no longer a vibration felt in the bones. It had grown into something the ear could catch if one stood still and let the wind fall away. A slow, deliberate pulse, somewhere between a note and a heartbeat, so low it seemed to come from the sea's very body. On the aft deck, Elias had his maps spread again, not modern ones, but reproductions of old charts inked by hands that believed the ocean to be scattered with islands that have long since vanished. His fingers traced the faded outlines of Antillia, St. Brendan's Isle, and Hybrasil. They called these phantom islands, he told Matthew, who stood beside him. But a phantom is only a thing seen out of place. It does not mean it was never real. That evening, as they passed the midpoint of the sixth day, Elias began telling the crew's stories. He didn't shout them across the deck. He spoke as if to himself, his voice low enough that the men had to lean in to hear. In 1721, a Dutch brig named Zeehond reported sighting columns beneath the surface, in water so clear they could see them 30 fathoms down. A storm drove them off before they could drop anchor. Their captain swore in his log he'd return, but the Zeehond burned in port 2 weeks later. Not one man survived to try again. Another night, a Portuguese vessel in 1606 claimed to have sailed into a stretch of water where the moonlight bent, making the horizon ripple like a mirror disturbed. They found themselves surrounded by low mists, and from those mists came voices speaking no tongue they knew. They left, but the voices followed for hours. Some men went mad, and later still, the Rosalind, 1889, last sighted near the Azores. 4 months later, her lifeboat washed up in the Caribbean. Inside, a single brass compass, its needle frozen, pointing not north, but straight down. The men tried to laugh at these tales, but it was forced, and each chuckle seemed to die quickly in the thickened air. By the 8th day, the sky began to distort. At first, it was only a trick of light. the clouds appearing to drift under the sun instead of across it. Then, at the far rim of the sea, a mirage-like shimmer rose and hung there for hours, neither approaching nor retreating. No one spoke of turning back, but a few of the younger crew started glancing east more often, as if measuring the way home in their minds. The older sailors didn't bother. They knew there are places in the world where a ship may pass a certain point and find the way back is simply gone. The hum deepened. It now had a pattern, for beats, then a pause, then for more, a kind of colossal breathing. And though no one said so aloud, more than one man had begun to dream of moving lights beneath the ship, lights that looked less like fish and more like the windows of buildings far below. On the 9th night, a storm threatened, black clouds massing at the edges of the strange half-light. But the clouds never reached them. Instead, they wheeled slowly around the ship, thunder muttering just beyond the horizon, as though held back by some invisible wall. The sea ahead remained glass-smooth. The La Belle Helene sailed on, and the sense of time began to fray. Watches grew unreliable. Men swore they had stood 2 hours at post when only 20 minutes had passed. Others claimed the opposite, that entire nights had been swallowed in what felt like minutes. By the 10th day, the ship's log bore no date. The captain, a man not given to superstition, simply stopped writing it. And then, on a morning when even the wind seemed hesitant, Elias stepped onto the quarterdeck, stared long into the hazy west, and smiled. "We are close now." The first shapes beneath. It began, as most strange things do, at sea, with something so small it could have been missed. A shift in color, not in the sky. That pale silver half-light still lingered, but in the water. For days it had been black-green, the hue of deep, unbroken ocean. But now, at the bow, where the ship's wake cleaved the surface, there was a softness to the shade. The green was lighter, not brighter, exactly, more like the memory of sunlight in a place where no sun should reach. The lookout, a Breton boy named Yves, was the first to mention it. He leaned down from the foremast and called to Matthew below. The water's changing. Matthew squinted over the side. From here, it was subtle, a kind of haze just under the surface, like a sheet of glass laid over something pale. He said nothing, but he stayed at the rail longer than usual, eyes fixed downward. By midday, the haze had spread. It moved with the ship, yet it didn't follow the wake. Instead, it stretched ahead, as if the vessel sailed not into open water, but across a pane of shallow sea. Though every lead line they dropped showed no less than 80 fathoms, the hum was louder now, even in the midst of the sailors' work. The groan of the capstan, the slap of canvas in the wind, that deep, deliberate beat threaded through everything. For pulses, a pause. For more, always the same. Elias spent the afternoon on the bowsprit, one hand gripping the forestay, leaning out over the water as though he could will it to give up its secrets. When he finally stepped back onto deck, his eyes had that same far-off glint they'd carried since Marseille, but sharper now, as if something he'd been chasing for years had just stepped into view. That night, the sea lit itself. It began with a faint green glow beneath the starboard side, so dim the men thought it the last smear of twilight. But it grew, slowly, steadily. The water under the ship became a rolling sheet of emerald fire, moving not with the currents but in its own rhythm, flashes that coincided perfectly with the hum. The glow revealed shapes. At first, they were no more than vague shadows, blurred by depth and motion. But as the ship slid onward, the outlines began to sharpen. Long, parallel lines, right angles, curves too deliberate for nature. Matthew called for the captain. The old man came to the rail, stared down, and said nothing for a full minute. Then, very quietly, he ordered the helmsman to hold course and speed. The crew crowded the rails now, silence spreading like contagion. There, beneath the keel, far below but unmistakable in form, lay what could only be the remnants of vast walls. Some toppled, some intact, their pale stone gleaming under the green light as if polished. Between them ran avenues, and in places where the streets widened, they opened into what might have been courtyards or plazas. And then came the tallest shapes, columns rising from the sea floor, thick as shipmasts, some broken halfway, others standing proud, their tops vanishing into the darkness above. The ship sailed on, and the ruins unfurled beneath, like a city scene from a slow, circling gull. No one spoke, no one dared. Hours passed, or minutes. Time was no longer a thing they could trust. Elias, standing at the fore, whispered something. A word, maybe a name, but the wind carried it away before anyone could catch it. The city beneath the keel, the green light did not fade. It did not pulse with the rise and fall of the ship, but with some slower, deeper rhythm that belonged to the sea itself. 4 beats, pause, 4 beats, and with each cycle, the ruins below seemed to shift slightly, as though the city were breathing. By the second hour of sailing over them, patterns began to emerge. The streets, if they could be called that, were not random. They radiated from a central point, a vast circular plaza, whose outline could just be made out beneath the veils of light. From it, wide avenues extended outward like spokes, ending in clusters of tall structures. No one used the word temple aloud, but the thought hung in the air like salt spray. The depth was impossible to guess. At times, the water seemed shallow enough for a man to dive and touch the tops of the tallest pillars. Then, as the ship drifted on, the same structures appeared to sink miles below, their bases swallowed in darkness. The crew stopped their usual duties. No sails were trimmed, no decks scrubbed. The La Belle Helene moved under a kind of trance, the wind holding steady, the sea to calm for nature. Even the gulls that had followed them since the Azores were gone. At night, the ruins glowed brighter, like fish scales, catching light, but always in pairs, always evenly spaced, as though they belonged to eyes. On the 3rd day, over the city, Elias asked for a sounding line to be dropped. The weight plunged into the water, unspooling fathoms of rope, and when the line was hauled back, the lead came up warm to the touch. Matthew, watching, muttered 70 fathoms, and the seas holding fire. Later, while most of the crew tried and failed to sleep, Elias told another of his stories. He did not speak to the group, but to the dark air itself, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. There is an old account from a Carthaginian trader, Hanno, they called him. He wrote of a land beyond the pillars of Heracles, where the nights shone as if lit from beneath the earth, and the water gave back no reflection. The men grew afraid and would not land, but they marked it on their maps, and the place was called the Silent Shore. The 4th day brought currents that defied the wind. The sails were full, but the La Belle Helene moved as though some unseen tide beneath her hull was deciding the course. No matter the helm's turn, the ship drifted ever westward, straight into the heart of the ruins. The buildings grew stranger. No two were alike. Some were square and heavy, with sloped sides like the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia. Others were all curves and spirals, as though shaped by water itself. One structure, long and low, had a roof that shimmered like beaten copper, even though no sunlight touched it. By the fifth night, a few of the men began whispering of movement among the ruins, not fish, not shadows from the ship, shapes that seemed to walk, tall, impossibly slender, and never looking up. The hum was everywhere now, in the wood of the deck, in the rigging, in the hollow of the chest. Men woke in the night with its rhythm in their bones, as though their hearts had been taught a new beat, and always, always, the green glow rising, pulsing, waiting, the drift without end. The sixth day dawned without sunrise. The sky did not brighten so much as it thinned, the darkness bleeding into a faint, silvery dusk that had no source. The crew found themselves unable to tell if it was early morning or late evening. The ruins below had changed again. They no longer lay flat. Now the avenues climbed and fell, as though the city had been built on rolling hills. Great staircases, their steps wide enough for 10 men abreast, ran from shadowed depths to platforms hung in mid-water. Some of these platforms bore nothing at all. Others cradled dark shapes like vessels or altars, carved from a black stone that drank the green light instead of reflecting it. The pulsing hum still held its 4-beat pattern, but now, between the cycles, came faint clicks and trills. They were high-pitched, almost like the calls of dolphins, but slower, deliberate, as if answering something unheard above. Elias recorded it all in a small notebook, his handwriting jagged from the sway of the deck. No one else dared to write. Even the ship's log remained untouched. On the 7th day, the water grew unnervingly clear. From the rail, a man could see straight down until his eyes ached. Every ruined archway and toppled column drawn in sharp detail. Tiny motes drifted in the light, some no bigger than dust, others large enough to make the sailors grip the rail in case they rose closer. Eve swore he saw one of them turn. The wind should have taken them east that day, but the ship kept sliding west, deeper into the heart of the city. The helmsman's knuckles whitened around the spokes, but the captain gave no order to resist. That night, the men saw their first statue. It lay toppled across an avenue, its head half buried in sand. Even from 70 fathoms up, the figure was enormous, twice the length of the La Belle Helene. Its features were strange, the face neither man nor beast, but something between. A crown of ridged fins swept back from the brow, and the mouth was set in an expression that might have been sorrow or warning. By the 8th day, the green light was joined by threads of pale gold. They appeared only at the edges of sight, winding between buildings, like streets lit from within. Sometimes they flared and vanished. Other times they flowed in long, lazy arcs, as though following some ancient pattern. Elias told another of his half-whispered histories. Plato wrote of it second-hand, from Spalma, who took it from the priests of Sais. But there are older stories, from the islands, from the West African coast. They speak of a land that sank not in a day, but over centuries, city by city, as the sea crept in. And in its final days, they say, it shone from beneath, as though the people lit their streets for the gods themselves to see. The 9th day brought fog, thick, low, and strangely scented, not of salt or rain, but of whetstone. It clung to the deck, pooled in the scuppers, and dripped from the rigging like melted glass. And still, beneath it all, the ruins glowed. The city turns its face. The 10th day began with a sound no one could name. It came not from the wind nor the sea, but from the very timbers of the La Belle Helene. A slow, drawn-out groan, as though the wood had aged 100 years in a heartbeat. Men clutched the rails, expecting some hidden reef to rise beneath them, but the water stayed impossibly clear. Beneath, the streets of the city had shifted. No one had seen it happen, yet there it was. Entire districts realigned. Plazas where there had been courtyards. Towers where only flat roofs had stood. The captain offered no explanation, and the crew knew better than to ask. The 11th day brought a stillness so complete it hurt the ears. The hum remained faint and regular, but all else fell silent. No slap of water on the hull, no creak of rope. Even the breathing of the men seemed muffled, as if the air had grown heavy. That night, they passed over a structure unlike any they had seen before. A vast circle of white stone, unbroken, polished, as if carved yesterday. At its center stood a single spire, thin as a mast, tapering to a point that caught the green light and split it into ripples. These ripples danced upward, breaking against the hull in faint flashes, like lightning trapped underwater. The 12th day, the currents grew playful. The ship began to drift in long, lazy arcs, circling certain parts of the ruins without any hand on the helm. Twice they passed the toppled statue from before, as if the city meant for them to see it again, to notice something they had missed. The second time, a gull, the first bird in days, wheeled low over the rail, then veered sharply away, vanishing into the mist without a single cry. By the 13th day, gold threads in the water had multiplied, weaving between the green glow in intricate patterns. Some of the crew began sketching them in charcoal, swearing the designs repeated every few hours. Others refused to look at them at all. Elias spoke again, his voice low and distant. There are Polynesian tales of Te Rua Maui, the pit of Maui, a place where the sea opens to show the cities beneath, not as they are now, but as they once were. They say it is not a place one can reach by choice. The sea must invite you. The 14th day, the invitation became clear. Without warning, the La Belle Helene slowed, the sails still full, but the hull dragging as though through syrup. Beneath them, the streets of the city converged into a single spiraling path, leading inward toward a black hollow at the city's core. From that hollow, no light rose, and yet the hum was strongest there, a deep, chest-vibrating call that seemed to say, "Closer." The 15th day, the sea began to rise, not in waves, but as a whole, lifting the ship higher above the ruins, as if carrying her toward something vast and unseen beyond the horizon. The men slept less, ate less. Their eyes shone in the half-light, fixed always on the water below, and the city watched back, the watching deep. The 16th day began with eyes. No one saw them open, yet there they were, faint gleams beneath the green and gold threads, always in pairs, always fixed on the hull. Some were small and near, like the eyes of fish. Others were vast, far below, so far that their slow blink seemed to take whole minutes. The men avoided leaning over the rails, not out of fear, though some felt it, but out of a strange, almost guilty awareness. The 17th day brought voices, not clear speech, but low murmurs that rose and fell with the rhythm of the hum. At first, the crew thought it was wind in the rigging, but there was no wind. Later, a few swore they heard their own names in those murmurs, stretched and softened until they were almost unrecognizable. By the 18th day, the city had begun to rise. It did not lift bodily toward them. Rather, certain structures seemed closer than before, their details sharper, their shadows longer. A colonnade of black stone appeared where the seafloor had been bare, days before. A pair of massive gates, half buried in silt, now stood ajar, the darkness beyond them unlit. The 19th day, the gold threads above the streets flared so brightly they lit the ship's hull from below. Patterns spread outward like frost on glass, spiraling toward the black hollow at the city's heart. The crew could not look away, even as their eyes burned from the light. That night, Elias spoke again, though this time it was not a story. "It's not ruins," he said, barely louder than the hum. "It's sleeping. We're waking it." On the 20th day, the fog returned, but it was different now, no longer drifting aimlessly. It moved in slow, deliberate swirls, curling along the deck as though searching. It gathered at the rails and leaned outward, streaming toward the water below. The 21st day, they passed over something no one could quite name. It was enormous, too large to see in its entirety, its edges fading into the distance beneath the green light. A lattice of white stone and shadow, curving inward as though forming the roof of some vast chamber. Between its arches, faint glimmers moved, not fish, not currents, but shapes that swam with the steady, synchronized rhythm of thought. By the 22nd day, the men no longer spoke to each other, except in whispers. They moved slowly, as though underwater themselves, their eyes always drawn back to the spiraling streets. Food spoiled faster than it should have. Ropes grew stiff, the iron of the fittings bloomed with rust overnight, and still, beneath it all, the hum, now deeper, now nearer. The 23rd day, the eyes in the water blinked in unison, every single one, and when they opened again, they were closer. The last day, it began in perfect stillness. The 24th morning did not break so much as unfold. The sky was the same pale dusk it had been for days, the air the same cool, damp breath of stone. The sea lay flat as poured glass, the only movement, the slow drift of golden threads just beneath the surface. The La Belle Helene floated above the black hollow at the city's heart. The spiraling streets, now fully visible, converged on its edge like tributaries feeding a whirlpool, though there was no motion, no pull, only depth, a depth that felt not empty but occupied. The hum was constant now, a single, sustained note that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It filled the sails without wind, settled in the bones, and pressed on the chest until breathing was a conscious act. The captain stood at the bow, hat in hand, eyes fixed straight ahead. No one spoke to him, no one dared. Midday brought the first ripple. It began far out near the horizon, a faint ring spreading outward across the still water. It traveled for minutes, smooth and unbroken, until it passed beneath the hull. The ship rocked once, as if in acknowledgement, and then the water stilled again. An hour later came the second ripple. This one was closer, faster, and when it reached the ship, the golden threads beneath flared, bright enough to cast shadows on the deck. By late afternoon, the ripples came steadily, each one nearer than the last. The eyes in the water no longer blinked. They were wide and fixed, their pale gleam unbroken. Elias closed his notebook for the first time in days and tucked it inside his coat. "If you see anything," he murmured, "don't follow it." It did not roll or drift, but ascended in straight, unbroken columns, as if pulled upward by invisible strings. Each column twisted slowly, and in each faint shapes seemed to turn. Profiles, hands, figures, half seen and half formed. The final ripple came without warning. It was not a ring, but a wall of water rising silently around the ship, perfectly smooth, perfectly vertical. It climbed higher than the masts and closed overhead, sealing the La Belle Helene inside a sphere of liquid light. The hum deepened, the golden threads brightened to blinding, and the black hollow below opened wider, not with motion, but by being. The ship tilted forward, not from wind, not from tide, but as if the hollow itself had leaned up to meet her. There was no crash, no roar, no shattering wood. The La Belle Helene simply passed through the surface and was gone. The sea stilled, the light faded, the city slept again. The water remembers. The La Belle Helene never returned to any port. No wreckage was found, no bodies, no sign of struggle. The official logs listed her as lost at sea, a phrase that, in its neat finality, hid far more than it revealed. Weeks later, a fishing vessel out of Papeete hauled up something tangled in its nets, a length of hemp rope stiff with salt, threaded with golden fibers that glimmered even under the gray morning sky. The captain kept it for a week before selling it to a trader bound for Marseille. It was never seen again. Months after that, on a remote beach in the Marquesas, a glass bottle washed ashore. Inside was a sheet of paper. The ink bled almost to nothing. Only one line was legible. It is not a ruin. It breathes. Some claimed the handwriting matched that of Elias Beaumont, the naturalist whose journals had fueled so many stories of the voyage. Others said it was a hoax, a cruel trick played on the families of the crew. And yet, every few years, sailors in the South Pacific still speak of strange hums in the water, of nights when the sea lies flat as stone and the stars seem to hang too low. Some claim that if you follow those sounds long enough, you'll see it. The faint glow of golden threads, spiraling toward a darkness that is not absence, but presence. Most turn back, a few do not. What lies at the heart of that spiral, no one can say, but the water remembers. It always remembers. The ocean was calm in that way sailors do not trust. Not flat, not glassy, but quiet, a slow, deliberate breathing beneath the hull of the La Belle Helene, as though the sea itself were considering something. The early light was soft, almost tender, and the ship's timbers creaked with the small, familiar sounds of another day beginning. From the quarterdeck, the horizon looked impossibly far, a pale smear where sky met water with no seam to tell them apart. The sails hung loose in the stillness, pale canvas turned almost silver by the morning. Above, gulls drifted in lazy circles, calling to one another in voices that carried much farther than the faint replies from the crew. Below decks, the smell of boiled coffee and salt pork drifted through the narrow passageways. Men moved without hurry, some barefoot, some in shirt sleeves, their motions well practiced from years at sea. A few still rubbed sleep from their eyes, ducking under beams worn smooth by countless heads. On deck, old Matthew the boatswain checked the rigging, as he did every morning, though there was no wind to warrant it. His hands worked without thought, fingers tracing knots he had tied so many times he could have done it blind. He paused only once, looking over the starboard rail toward a line of pale blue water that shimmered faintly beneath the surface. It was too early in the voyage for that kind of shimmer, and he knew it. The captain, Etienne Lenoir, emerged from his cabin with the slow precision of a man who understood the importance of appearing unshaken. He was not tall, but carried himself as though height were something a man could will into being. In one hand he held his brass spyglass, in the other a sheet of thin parchment on which a circle had been drawn. Not a compass rose, not a navigational mark, but something older. The lines were faint, worn from being traced too often. By mid-morning, the sea was still without a breath of wind, and conversation among the men settled into low, unhurried tones. A few leaned over the rails to watch the long ribbons of kelp that had begun to appear. These were not the tangled brown weeds of the northern oceans, but slender strands the color of beaten gold, swaying lazily with the current. When the sunlight caught them just right, the water seemed to burn with a faint, living light. The youngest hand on board, Pierre, a boy of barely 16, swore he could see the threads moving against the current. The older men told him to keep his eyes to his work. Still, he looked back more than once. In the chart room, Elias Beaumont, the naturalist, was already at work. His table was spread with journals, some his own, others far older, their bindings cracked, their margins crowded with notes in a dozen hands. One book, its leather soft from decades of use, lay open to a page marked with a pressed sprig of something that looked like seagrass. Beside it, a delicate ink drawing showed an underwater archway, its stones carved with spirals. Elias traced the drawing with one finger, as though it might tell him something the ink alone could not.